Welcome to today's lesson on American government. There are three things I want to focus on today. The first one is to understand the different parts of American government. So later in the course, when we talk about Congress or the Senate or the role of the president and the power they possess, you have a bit more of an understanding from what we're doing today. Secondly, to understand a bit more about the relationship between state and central government. Even understanding those two terms, state and central government, can be quite complicated, but we'll understand a little bit more about what they mean and the relationship between those two types of government. And finally, to start to think about the strengths and weaknesses of the American political system. And in particular, if you take our opening couple of lessons, does the American political system lend itself to supporting the likes of those migrants coming in or those different ethnic groups? And that's an ongoing question we even face today in our society. So our best starting point to understand American government is looking back at the Constitution. And this was created in the year 1787 after the American Wars of Independence. So the Americans managed to break away from British colonial control, and the Constitution was really the foundation of the new way of running the country. Now, it was never going to be perfect because obviously it was made on the back of a revolution, and there had to be ways of updating it on the back of their learning experiences. And so they created a system whereby amendments, if you had enough support, could be made to the Constitution. And up until the year that we're studying, 27 amendments have been made to the Constitution in total. Now, the first 10 amendments, because, like I say, initially it was never going to be perfect, were quite quick after 1787, in and around that time, and they were known as the Bill of Rights. And what they did was they established things like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, of the press, the right to petition the government, but in particular things like the right to carry weapons for self-defense and to have access to a fair and proper trial. And some of these amendments and these parts of the Constitution will come up in our studies later. Now, the second thing to understand about American government, because it was 13 states that had worked together to defeat the British, is they also didn't want to have, a bit like Britain was doing, someone centrally controlling them. So they also had their own state governments, okay? And that's why it's known as a federal system, because it's got both central government, but it's also got state government. Okay, now central government runs the whole country, state governments look after their own individual states. And what you're hopefully starting to see even at this point is there could potentially be a clash there between what the central government want to do and the independent states might want to do something different. Now, there are certain specified powers, so the central government control things like foreign policy, defence, trade and currency, and then there are other powers that are sort of owned and run by their own individual states. On the next slide, I'm going to show you three images of the three branches of central government, and I just want you to spend a moment thinking, do you recognise these buildings and what might they represent in relation to American government? So I'll just bring those up for you now. Okay, so I don't know how much you recognise here, but the first one is the White House, the House of the President. The second one is the Congressional Building. And the third and final branch of government is the Supreme Court, the judiciary. So I just want to go into these in a little bit more detail so you understand exactly what role they play in government. Firstly, the President. The President is both the head of government, a little bit like our Prime Minister today, but also the head of state, so a bit like our Queen today. They're directly elected by the people, so you've got the upcoming election with Trump this year. And their sort of main role, I suppose, is they are commander-in-chief of the army and the navy. and they serve for a period of 4 years, and they can do a maximum of 2 terms in office. So Barack Obama had back-to-back terms. Now, the second branch of government is Congress, and Congress is split into 2 houses. The first one is the House of Representatives. They're elected every 2 years, and that's based on sort of proportional representation. So every sort of congressman represents a proportion of the population, and the states with the most people have the most representatives. The second house in Congress is the Senate, and whereas the House of Representatives fluctuates and each state has a variable number, in the Senate each state has 2 representatives, 2 senators, and they serve for 6 years. They don't all serve at the same time, so every 2 years there's an election, and 1/3 of the Senate are elected every 2 years. The main role of these 2 houses is really the legislature. They are the lawmakers of the nation. Yes, the president can come up with ideas, but it has to be passed through both houses in Congress. And in particular, they have a say on tax and war, and they can sort of agree or reject decision making by the president on tax and war. Lastly, the Supreme Court. This is made up of 9 judges. They are nominated by the president, and then they have to be approved by Congress before they're confirmed in position. Their main role is to oversee the Constitution and make sure that the Constitution is obeyed, and ultimately they'll also decide whether new laws that are created by Congress are constitutional or not. Do they fit in with the constitutional rights of the Americans? So I don't know, looking at these 3 branches, if you're starting to think, well, how do they work together, or where does power lie? And that's the big sort of ongoing dilemma in American politics, is who has the power. And the Constitution was created with this idea of checks and balances. Okay, so take the top 2, for example. The top left-hand corner is the president. Okay, now the president can veto legislation that's created by Congress, but in return, Congress can impeach the president if they are not following constitutional rules. So the idea is that they watch over each other, and it maintains a sort of stable, balanced system of government. And I'll just give you a moment to take a quick look at the detail on the second image. Okay, so that's central government, that's how it works. And let's move on to look at state government. So America, as we discussed when we looked at the Senate in Congress, is made up of 50 states, and each one has their own state government. Now, what makes it a little bit easier for us is that state government is broken down into 3 strands, very much like central government. So in central government, you have the president. In a state, you have a governor. You also have, a little bit like Congress, a state legislature. They are the ones who oversee the law making. And finally, you have state courts within each state. So very much it's the same model as central government, but on a state level. And I really like this diagram sort of to sum up. It sort of shows you how they all work together and some of the decisions that they can make on a state level. Because in America, some states have the death penalty, some don't, and some deal with it in different ways than others. So that's, again, quite a contentious issue. So another question we need to ask ourselves is, how democratic is America? That's a huge question, but we'll do our best to sort of touch upon the key things we need to know for the course. So firstly, it's important to understand that there are 2 main political parties in America, the Republicans and the Democrats. And in the early 20th century, the Republicans are very much seen as the Conservative Party, and that's still the case in many ways today, whilst the Democrats are viewed as the more sort of progressive Liberal Party. Now, the USA is a democracy. Electors vote for the president, Congress, men, senators, governors, the members of their state government. And in some states, they also vote for judges. Everyone over 18 can vote in America. But when we go back to the start of the Constitution in 1787, not everyone had the right to vote who was over 18. And so in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to all citizens, regardless of their race, colour or religion. However, it wasn't as simple as that, because many states found a way round this. So, for example, Indians were not classed as citizens. In some states, they required a voter to be able to read before they could vote. Others stated that you needed to live in a state for a particular length of time. And in one particular state, you had to take an oath that you were not a supporter of communism. So it's not as simple as, because the amendment has passed, everyone has the right to vote. States actually put their own restrictions on enabling people to vote. Now, another amendment was made in 1920, the 19th Amendment, and that enabled all women to vote who are over the age of 18. So in some respects, these amendments are progressive. They are allowing people more rights, but it doesn't always translate into what it says on the surface. The final big question to tackle here is around government interference in everyday life. And it's even a controversial question today about the role government should play in our day-to-day lives. So the first thing to consider really is the power of the president, and it's important to sort of state, despite all of the checks that were built into the Constitution, they are incredibly powerful today, and that's been proven no better than the likes of Donald Trump and the way he's sort of very dismissive of ministers and what states have to say about the way he runs the country. But Trump is also an example that America is a land of opportunity, and again, that was something that was built into the Constitution and the American psyche, this idea of people making it from nothing. And if you look at Trump's background, a businessman who's gone into politics, he was able to become president regardless of that. Another great example is Abraham Lincoln, and he started life as the son of a poor farmer, and again it's proof to all that you can make your way to the very top. And in more recent history, another great example is the success of Obama and what he achieved in his 2 terms as president, and again making giant strides for American society. So the Founding Fathers wanted to create opportunity, they wanted to give hope for people, they also wanted to restrict the power of the president, but what they also wanted to avoid most of all was involvement in people's everyday lives. Don't forget, in 1787 they wanted to break away from Britain because there was too much central control. They were being taxed and they had no voice, the Americans, and that's what led to them fighting for their independence. And that's very much the dividing line between the two parties today. The Republicans really aim to interfere very little in people's lives, whilst the Democrats actually want to get more involved, especially in times of need, to protect the civil rights and the rights of individuals. And I don't know where you stand on it. It's a very controversial issue. It's one we'll discuss in class in more detail. But it's important to understand that real distinction between the two parties. One is the party of sort of complete independence for the people. One is much more about government involvement to support the people.